we're now going to hand over to Geoffrey Cornelius, who Angela introduced earlier on. And I think Geoffrey is going to open up different practices and ways of engaging with these different levels of things by looking at some divinatory examples. Geoffrey, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, Mary, for such a wonderful lead into participation and contemplation. And I hope to show this at work in issues of divination now. Now, can you all see the screen satisfactorily?
Yes, looking good, Geoffrey.
Yes, thank you. Okay. Now, I've got a lot to cover, as expected, in this 20 minutes, including both practical, but also a little bit of theoretical consideration, which is needed to launch us into this. Now, as you see, I'm suggesting that we celebrate, as celebrands, we celebrate divination. And I've put the wording there, inductive divination as transformative practice. Now, those of you who know your Platonic tradition will know that the high Platonic tradition from Plato onwards tends to eschew what is called by the scholars inductive divination, which run from practices such as augury onwards, because these involve active mental process amongst in the diviner and the people understanding the materials divine. And there's a tendency in the Platonic tradition to consider only on theos, infused and inspired divination. But I'd like to draw your attention to the tremendous cultural power of the divinatory forms that arise in various cultures. And I can best do this by showing you what I will suggest are 3 major ways in which you could enter, if you so wish to, the practice of inductive divination as transformative. Let me see if I can go straight to, all right, oh, okay. Let's see, 1, 2. Right, here we go. Sorry to. I've given you an illustration there of the New Age, of course, is a vast metaphor with which we only partially engage, but it's a powerful metaphor from astrology, which would need much expansion to go into. But one thing the New Age has given us is this extraordinary cross-fertilization of cultures. So I'm showing you there 3 major forms of practical divination, well known to many of you, and you've probably experienced them in some shape or form, and you probably pass them by. I doubt if many of you are practitioner diviners. So I'm not advocating that everybody takes this sort of path, but I'd like to show you what happens when you do. So I'm illustrating to you the work of the astrology, which is a royal art, absolutely the West royal art of divination, although frequently as practitioners don't realize that it is so. That's another problem. Now that requires quite a bit of technical baggage to get into, but those of you who know something of the symbolism of the planets, find a decent astrologer who says things that accord with what you're interested in, get them to look at your horoscope, ask them to show you passages of text that explain some of the factors in very simple symbolic terms, and you might find that you can actually engage astrology. But I'm not advocating that as a path for practical inquiry to most of you at this point. Very well known to many of you will be the tarot. So if you were going to enter tarot, what's interesting you see about these great forms of divination, major forms of inductive divination in each culture take the original act of augury and omen reading into sophisticated ethical and philosophical and scientific forms, which gives them a certain complexity, but allows this extraordinary bridge between left and right hemispheres, because you have to have an analytical disposition as well as a symbolic disposition in order to work with inductive divination. And each great form of divination, I'll assert, which would need a whole seminar to justify, does try to seek this higher ethical, philosophical, and scientific culmination of its thinking. You get this in tarot, where the tarot practitioner begins to look to Kabbalah underlying the tarot, or look to the Western esoteric mysteries. And if you wanted to start off into this material of tarot, which is very simple and powerful to work into, I just recommend to you to start with the tremendously harmonious Pamela Coleman Smith illustrations of the tarot, inspired by Arthur Edward Waite. And look at his work, because he'll take you into quite a pure esoteric tradition of reading the tarot that's both practical, serves the need of what could be called fortune telling, and yet serves this higher need that I'm interested in. But actually, the one I'm going to suggest to you, for those of you who don't know much about divination, it might surprise you, is a tremendous entrant from the East, is the I Ching, or Book of Changes, which since Jung's work with it, in the well-known edition where he wrote a foreword and talked about the principles of synchronicity, has become very well known to New Agers and New Religionists and people in our time, the I Ching, Book of Changes. And if you're going to enter practical divination, you haven't tasted it before, and you are interested, I would suggest you go for the I Ching, because it's achieved perhaps the highest of all ethical integrations in any culture, bringing divination in line with ethics, philosophy, natural science, all brought together in one text of enormous power and enormous sacred volition. And you will be in safe hands using the I Ching. Jung said it's like having a wise old figure guiding you and speaking to you through the I Ching. Now I'm going to take an entry into, let's see, whoops, sorry, that's it. My particular interest in hermeneutics is that the Neoplatonic, Judaic and Christian forms of hermeneutic of interpretation, as you've already heard from your other speakers, offers a way that actually is unparalleled and can't be matched by modern philosophical hermeneutics. Modern philosophical hermeneutics does not touch the power of these ancient forms, including my particular interest, the Christian four senses of interpretation. And just as Dante was able to show that this works in poetics and is a poetic form, so I suggest that this is also a divinatory form, and will show you and unwind and unravel some of the mysteries and the dilemmas we encounter in divination. The four senses are the literal meaning of things, the allegorical, where one begins to see symbolism behind the literal, and then the absolutely key tropological level, where one turns oneself and realizes that one is addressed by the omen. Now, going back to most ancient understandings of augury, what is absolutely key about omens, of which all these forms of inductive divination are systems of omen reading, is that one begins to realize that one has been addressed by the omen, addressed as by one intelligence to another intelligence, which is yours. And the recognition of that brings this marvelous turning of the tropology. And this can be observed in the hermeneutics of divination in all forms, I would suggest. So let me go a little bit further, back to my three forms. I'm going to suggest to you that we look at the I Ching. Those of you who don't know it, it's extremely simple to get into it, extremely profound, and you will never get out of it if you once get interested in it. And the simple method of taking an oracle is with 3 coins. There's some Chinese copper bronze, 3 coins that designated yang and yin sides, heads and tails, thrown 6 times, gives you a 6-line figure, a hexagram, one of the 64 states of reality. Now, I'm going to turn to another thinker here before we move on into the material. Quite a different sort of thinker, a scientist, a tremendous philosopher, and his last great work, The Tacit Dimension, taught us that there is something in our knowing that we cannot easily tell. We know more than we can tell. And this is what divination opens out, and symbol opens out, something that cannot be told in our ordinary terms, in our Flatland terms, that leads us somewhere else. And I would suggest that divination itself, properly understood, is a bringing forth of that knowing that we cannot tell. One of the key themes of Polanyi is the idea that emergence phenomena occur as you enter this borderland state. As you enter the state beyond the flatland, something emerges that is a wisdom that you did not know you had, and a sharing that you did not know you had, and it emerges in the material. And great systems of divination seek to have this pure and sacred and authenticated sense of emergence from the sacred other into our practical reality. So, wonderful thought of emergence. Now, I said to you that from ancient times, this has been associated with augury. And in fact, the old augurs and people of antiquity and back to Homeric and earlier understandings of the gods and daimons know that in fact the daimon is in response to us. The gods are in response to us and participate with us. And in fact, they need us in certain ways. God needs us. And that means that actually, although there are such things as fates that befall us, what we call destiny is actually open to our own negotiation, our own character, our own way of responding to the nature of reality. And that, of course, is what participation and tropology also means. Fulfilling our destiny is also our responsibility. So the God says, okay, meet me halfway here. And that's a marvelous understanding. But, because I'm interested in the intersections between these different states of approach between the four senses, it is very easy for this transactional relationship with divination, its phenomenon, because divination speaks rapidly to you. And you'll find if you think about divinations that you take, if you're used to it, and certainly when you've introduced a beginner to one of the divinatory forms, the tarot, astrology, if you're an astrologer, the I Ching, you'll get marvelous synchronistic hits right straight off where the oracle is addressed in simple language, turns of the person, and they see it for themselves. And that's what a diviner seeks to achieve when a client comes to a diviner. However, there is a possible fall here. And this is where, as Mark has said, and our other speakers have said, it isn't a simple path where we simply open up to these things. It is easy for this attitude that one is in participation with sacred powers to lead to an egotistical willing and controlling of sacred powers. This is a decay that occurs in magic and has decayed in divination. A merely transactional attitude can then begin to set in, as if you have a system by which you negotiate with the spiritual. And then to understand what Jung says in his foreword to the I Ching. It doesn't offer itself with proofs and results. It's not easy to approach. And yet, like a part of nature, it waits until it is discovered. And then this extraordinary statement. It offers neither facts nor power, but for lovers of self-knowledge, of wisdom, if there be such, it seems to be the right book. Neither facts nor power, but wisdom. Now, how can that be? You see, an over-simple, egotistical and transactional relationship with the divine, using divination to approach the divine, can, of course, gain facts and power from the material. There is no doubt that there are things that you could call facts that are attained, but not reliably so, and not in the way that people might wish to be so. Facts do emerge, and power does emerge in divination, but actually, that is only at a surface level of the understanding of divination, because the true understanding comes with wisdom, with that tropological turn that turns towards the anagogic. So, I will show you very briefly how you might enter this. So, those of you who haven't considered divination before, as I say, it isn't a path for everybody, not a path for every seeker. There are other ways that suit different people in different ways. But if you will become a practitioner of these things and realize the potential, and then you also apply this subtler hermeneutic understanding to it, I think you will find yourself well rewarded by what occurs to you. So, the problem of the transactional. Let me show you from this other tradition the tradition of the I Ching. What is marvelous about the I Ching, you see, it is completely integrated over several thousand years, philosophy, ethics, science, natural phenomena, and divination into one harmonious whole with an extraordinary body of literature and sub-commentary on it, very wise sub-commentaries and debates within the Chinese tradition itself. All of these can be enjoyably entered once you start picking up your Wilhelm I Ching and do a few divinations for yourself. And don't be fussed about what I've said about transaction. Ask the I Ching if you should get a second mortgage. Ask the I Ching if you should do something practical. It's not averse to giving you this sort of practical approach. Just realize that its concern is always to lead you into some further space. The Sufis used to say, materializing the spiritual and spiritualizing the material. It's an interplay of our ordinary concerns in the Flatland world with other deeper sacred concerns. There isn't a complete divide as if these two worlds don't belong together. They're constantly in play. But there is a question of attitude here, and this is important for every diviner and every practitioner. And those of you who know divination perhaps will see this. Here's one of the 5 masters of the Sung Neo-Confucian revival that occurred in the 11th century of our era, a great revival of ancient learning, when there was much discussion of the meaning and nature of the I Ching and of divination and oracles. Look at this rather stern rebuke from Zheng Yi. In antiquity, divination was used to resolve doubt. Divination today is not like that. It is to determine the length of one's life and calculate one's success. That is all. And that's a scathing denouncement of divination understood simply transactionally as a benefit for ego, which it will give those benefits to some degree, but they are not reliable spiritual benefits and they do not last. Divination must have duration and last, and it's only when it's practiced as a form of wisdom, anthropology, and self-knowledge. So Zheng Yi is a bit harsh. Every age probably thinks that its age has become corrupt and the previous age was wiser than itself. This is a very common theme, and Zheng Yi is probably being a little over-dismissive, but you can take that censure from him. How are you using your divination? Is it simply only transactionally? Does it begin to have an egotistical thread to it? Watch that. You see, if you go back to omen reading and augury, the god, the gods, the diamond, the spirit, the higher self has addressed you by communicating something that it knows you as a totality require to understand. It isn't addressing you simply to satisfy your daily needs, even though your daily needs are pressing concerns and you have a right to ask the diamond for help in them. There's not a hard division I want to make here. Divination can be playful and practical, but it must always have that ethic of profundity. So now I'm going to move to an important divination and show you this at work, and then you'll see what I mean. I'd love to show you many cases of divination with the I Ching, but I'll simply move straight forward because time is pressing. Basic construction of the I Ching is based on 8 3-line figures. When they're doubled, you get 64 6-line figures, which are called hexagrams. And a hexagram is arrived at by the simple act of the coin oracle throwing 3 coins 6 times. Now, once you become a practitioner of divination, you'll find that often divinations recur in your life. Let me show you one that recurred for me and has taken on. This happens to the diviner where they're asking questions about something they think is important, and then you get the same hexagram come up at several points and you realize it's with you and you have dreams about it and it stayed with you. And this happened to me with the contemplation or view hexagram, wind over earth. And that is, as Wilhelm explains, image text. The wind blows over the earth, the image of contemplation. Thus the kings of old visited the regions of the world, contemplated the people and gave them instruction. And the oracle explains that this is like a watchtower, two sets of walls going up and a tower at the top that can be seen across the plains. And this gives the idea that you can gaze out across the world from a great distance, but also become a model for the world. It's an important image, but I never understood a certain depth of it until quite later in my life. Let me show you. The judgment says something very extraordinary, and I remember being shocked by beginning to understand this to me as a teacher of these things. Contemplation, the ablution has been made, but not yet the offering. Full of trust, they, all the people of the plains and the people watching the king, look up to him. The ablution has been made, not yet the offering. We're at that mid-stage of the crisis, of a spiritual crisis, where we need to go further to fulfill it. And that's the tropological turn. Everything is waiting for you to make this turn. And I came across then quite late on a distinction made by both Augustine and Aquinas on the nature of contemplation, speculo, specular, the idea that you can see it as looking out from a watchtower across a plain, or you can begin to see it as seeing yourself in the watching as you watch across the plain. And the true contemplation is the one where you see yourself in the watching, rather than simply standing there as a figure to be admired by all and seeing from afar. And that, I realise, is in the very same thought in a different tradition coming through here. And once again, that is a tropological turn. So I'm going to add one further thought from Jung here, and it's bring me back to astrology. You see, all of these forms of practical inductive divination offer you metaphors by which you may see yourself as if naked in a mirror. And there's the astrologer there, Astro Annie, leading the client to a mirror. And the astrologer has the skill and ability and the technical know-how and also the ethic that allows the client to do this. And the client begins to see herself, himself, naked in the cosmos. Her truth is revealed. And Jung asks us, of course, is this subjective or objective? Is it material or spiritual? Is it synchronicity or science, this act of divination? Because divination works, there's no doubt about it. If you use practical inductive divination, you will find many instances when a truth known only to you is exposed directly, not even to the knowledge of the astrologer, but to you, and you know you've been addressed. You've been addressed by the God, the diamond, the higher self. Okay, so how does this work? And Jung brought forward his idea of synchronicity, very much having studied astrology in the I Ching. As Jung wisely says, actually we step out of that mirror. It goes into the alchemist's study, his alchemist's workroom. The naked lady, who is the truth of the person seeing in the mirror, steps out of the mirror into the room. And as Jung observes, when we ask these questions, science, synchronicity, subject, object, when we make our clever categorizations, nature is not so simple. So do look again at methods of inductive divination available to you. Note my heeding that I suggest you that there are three major forms that the modern Westerner has: tarot, astrology, and I Ching. And of these, the I Ching is by far the safest and most obvious in many ways, because it will give you remarkably a direct text as well as an image, whereas tarot will stir you with powerful imagery, and you might need somebody to hold your hand for its powerful imagery. And astrology brings a lot of technical baggage and misunderstanding by astrologers themselves. So of these ways, I'm suggesting to you my particular love for the I Ching. So I hope that's given you a taste of the nature of practical divination and the possibilities there are in it, and also a guard of the way in which there are issues in divination, not to be misled simply and tempted into it, to let ego take over, but always be listening. But once you do that, you can play with it. You can let your mind ramble into it. It will allow you to do that. As Goethe said, there is a benevolent conspiracy here. All this wishes to help us. Have no doubt about that. So perhaps that's all I need to say on this subject at this point. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. Your thoughts there particularly reminded me actually of Socrates' wrestling with the message from the Delphic oracle, and how he had to really test it out. It had said to him that no one was wiser than he. But if he took that at face value, it would have led to a kind of ego inflation. And he had to go and find anyone who were wiser, and then realize that his wisdom lay in that he didn't know much. It was uncertainty and living at the edge of what he knew and didn't know before the oracle that was the source of his wisdom. So this sense of testing things out and almost the kind of negative way that's involved in the play was coming through. One of the things that was coming through for me there with your presentation.
Thank you ever so much for that, because yes, the Socratic wisdom here is absolutely key, and I so agree with you. And of course, what happens is that Socrates realized that he is being proved, not the oracle. We turn it around and think, how can I prove oracles? What an oracle does is prove you. And the word prove can be related to how sailors tested the proof strength of rum, whether it could be watered down by the captain. If it didn't catch light, then it wasn't proof. And you have to have the alcohol spirit fire up, and then it is proved. And the proving of an oracle is the truth that you make with the oracle, not some category that can be studied from the outside of the oracle. It's always between you and the God. We participate in our oracles, in our own destiny, and in the signs and omens given to us. And that above all is Socratic wisdom. So Mark, thank you very much for that.
I'm very glad that chimes with your thinking there. Now we've got about 10 minutes before we move to Louise for another more contemplative moment. And there've been a few questions in the chat, which we might pick up here now. And if anyone else had a question, then there's a few moments now before 12:15 when we move to Louise. Geoffrey, one quite basic one actually, which would be really helpful is, could you give us a definition of divination? And then in particular, what you mean by inductive divination. That sort of basic step would be really useful.
Yes. Inductive divination. Let me clarify that. I probably mentioned it very quickly. There's a counterintuitive definition given in the classical tradition, and we find it particularly in Cicero, between what is called natural divination and artificial divination. And artificial divination is where you have to read signs and omens and see them metaphorically and interpret them, whereas natural divination is direct contact with the god given entheos, where you might speak directly, as the Pythia is understood to sometimes speak directly the words of Apollo, when one is untheos, and direct clairvoyance might be a form of untheos. You see, what so interests me about inductive divination is that it always moves towards language. It moves to a language form because one practitioner can look over the shoulder of another initiate practitioner and see whether they have or have not made a bit of a hash of the divination. This is extraordinary. An astrologer can look over the shoulders of another astrologer, and because there is a shared collective language that builds up within that form of divination, you actually have something that becomes coherent in a culture. This is as true of the bones, of the forms of bones being shaken and done, as it is between the tradition of astrology or the tradition of reading the I Ching. It's not that there's right and wrong here. It is that it is communicable analytically and in intellect, which is why I say that inductive divination, the reading of signs and omens, which based in augury is its fundamental root, and it is like the reading of synchronicities, can be shared and is a shared language of that synchronicity, and it builds into a cultural form of great power, as we know with the types of astrology. You see, we have enduring symbolism of astrology that gathers even ignorant people together and non-spiritual and flatland people together and practitioners together in a common speaking. And that's a gift of lateralizing left and right hemisphere functions, because we can't all be entheos, directly inspired by divinity at every moment, but we can use our rational intellects to approach divination each time we wish to do so. And it's open to us. It's benevolently open. I hope that it explains the particular distinction about inductive divination. And as I say, many Platonists are squiffy about inductive divination because they think it introduces too much human reason into the matter. And in fact, I'm saying this is a high cultural development, best seen actually with the cultural development of the I Ching in China, a supreme cultural achievement of divination in culture, shareable and capable of commentary, which is why I love the Christian tradition of the four senses hermeneutic, because that is a shared medieval tradition of commentary and discourse about its very nature, of a very sophisticated type, incidentally. And so I do take the four senses from Christian hermeneutics as quite a model for developing a hermeneutic of divination in general. I hope that makes some sense and isn't too obscure.
Yes, thank you. I think Gregory Shaw's book on iamblichus, theurgy and the soul, picks up, I think, the completion in a way of the Platonic tradition, which doesn't get sniffy about the many forms of it. I'll put that in the chat. It's a very, very good book that I think resonates with what you're saying.
Yes,
just
absolutely.
another question, which I'll just pick up from the chat, because a couple of people have asked about runes and whether you have any thoughts on how runes fit into what you're saying.
Yes, I thought there'd be somebody coming in with some other form of divination. There are many manses and different forms of divination, and runes, of course, has a real locus in Northern European culture. I would say that I've not seen intellectual development and discourse concerning the nature of rune work that satisfies me that it quite has the level that's been achieved, say, with tarot, when associated with the Western mysteries and Kabbalah. Or indeed with the Jing, but that isn't in any way to discredit runes. It's just that of the many manses and forms, very few of them show forth their intellectual power. They'll show their synchronistic power immediately to you, and the basic runes reading will expose, as coming to the naked to the metaphoric mirror, will expose motive and intention and things you're going to do. It is just that there hasn't been a secondary higher literature, higher discourse in the subject. And it's that higher discourse that reveals the ethic at work in the subject. Astrology is highly problematic there because of its objectivity, its apparent objectivity. It misleads the practitioner into thinking this is an objective phenomenon only that can be taken up as you will without a true apology to it. But that's another story, and it's a story of the problem of Western astrology itself. I don't know if that.
No, again,
so, in
that's
other
very
words, there are
helpful.
many divinatory forms.
Yeah, no, that's a very clear point. And again, this sense that the synchronicities, in a way, are just the first level, the insight and the intellectus that, as Heraclitus put it, can listen in to the intellectus of the cosmos. That's a crucial part of all this as well.
Yes, what happens, people go to diviners because they do have a doubt or problem of the soul. So you see, Jing is quite right. Divination works at its most powerful when the soul is torn in two about the path it should take. It feels resolved in one direction, but it cannot finally determine that that is truthful. At that point, a powerful synchronicity will arise to guide the person. But if you don't know how to read the signs, then you're stumped, which is why people go to sign readers and organized forms of divination. And this will frequently happen in antiquity. An ominous occurrence will arise, like a two-headed lamb being born. And then you go to the diviners, who will then formally divine in order to seek a higher resolution of the material. And that is the function of the great forms of divination. So look at the forms of divination that attract you and ask whether they do have that higher ethic and purpose embedded into the discourse and teachings directly of the material themselves. You will find that in the best literature on tarot and in astrology, and absolutely in the I Ching, and I can affirm that to you.
Thank you very much. Now, look, I'm going to suggest we've got a couple of minutes now before 12:15, when we're going to join Louise for another contemplative exercise. And I'm just going to suggest that we stand up and we turn around and have a minute break and come back down into ourselves, as well as contemplating these higher things, and pick things up again, bang on 12:15 in a couple of minutes. Thank you very much, Mary and Geoffrey, for what you've added to our thoughts this morning.